This video is purely educational. It does not promote or depict real money play. No real hands are shown. What if I told you that there is a common line that even professional poker players miss that is one of the highest EV exploits in the most common formation in poker? Would you believe me? It's true, and I can honestly say that in my years of professional playing and coaching experience, I have never met a single high-stakes player who has been overusing this exploit. And here I am on YouTube, just giving it away for free. Allow me to introduce to you the power of the flop donk in single raise pots. No, it is not a fish move. In this video, I'll explain exactly why the flop donk is a key part of an optimal, powerful big blind defense that crushes. I'll explain my research based on mass data, game theory, and solver strategy. I'll provide examples explaining how and where big blind should implement flop donks for maximum effectiveness. And I will showcase parts of the new Premium Savant course focused on mastering this line. Let's get into it. This is going to be highly powerful. First and foremost, let's start with an extreme case, donking in a completely non-solver approved spot like King 9-7. On this board, it's very clear that in position has a strong range advantage. They clearly hold many more strong top pairs and sets than big blind. So big blind does not donk and checks with their entire range to protect the more medium strength hands in their range. But here's the thing, to prevent big blind from donking, button is almost never allowed to fold against a bet. In addition, they have to raise 27% of the time, as shown in this solution. Mass data shows that most players overfold and underraise. And no, I'm not encouraging players to start donking on these non-solver approved boards, but I do want to highlight that the mistakes that opponents are making could, in theory, allow big blind to donk. Here's a very conservative estimate of how players will defend as in position. I locked button's folding frequency to 25%, which is still less often than most players fold according to mass data. I also decreased the raising frequency down to 15%, which again is still more often than most players will raise. And in response, big blind is choosing to donk more than 60% of the time. And this isn't even considering the other additional exploits we have in this line. Needless to say, donking is great. And it gets even better when you add on to it the fact that most in-position players will c-bet too often after big blind checks. Essentially, big blind can make a lot of EV by donking hands like Jack X or Queen X that would otherwise have to fold against a c-bet. The EV of donking goes up, and the EV of checking goes down, and most players are not aware of that. As I mentioned, against most opponents, I do not encourage that big blind starts donking on all of these random non-solver approved boards. However, solver does donk quite often in theory on lower boards, and data shows that professional players miss even those donks. In fact, most regs, from more casual 50NL players all the way up to 2KNL pros, donk 4 times less often than the solver does. They will frequently check range on lower boards like this one, passing up a fantastic exploit. In my opinion, this is because most players are not comfortable playing in this line. Donk bets can be very tricky to implement because some of the lines are a bit unintuitive and mistakes are very easy to make when the player is out of position. But I'm here to clear things up for you. We're going to learn exactly how big blind can implement the donk effectively using information that's available even in just the free section of that new donk course. This information will cover both important theoretical and exploitative points that help players avoid making some common mistakes. Starting with the theory, if there's only a few things you take away from this video, I want this section to be one of those things. It is vital to note that solver donks more from early positions, mostly on lower connected boards. Some examples include 7-6-4, 8-7-5, or 6-5-3. Late position donks, like in cutoff and button, happen a little less often and shift towards slightly lower, more connected textures like 6-4-3 or 5-4-3. Solver also mixes in some donks on lower paired boards and wheel flops, but at a lower frequency. And in general, as a quick bonus tip for you guys, donking will be a little bit worse on those wheel ace-high boards. According to the data, donking will be better on lower boards because in-position players are prone to making bigger mistakes there, and coincidentally, that's also where solver likes to donk. This is exactly where big blind should maximize their donking. It's simply a mistake to look at this flop and to miss the opportunity. Next up, it's an important theory point to understand why big blind's donks are always small, around 30% pot. Taken directly from the latest Savant course, the reason why out of position bets small is because most of their range is still weak pairs that do not want to inflate the pot. These hands are protected by strong hands and get called by worse like ace highs and weaker pairs. A bigger bet does not suit these hands, and if big blind checked them instead and played a more polar strategy, then the weaker pairs would simply get wrecked by in-position c-bets. Of course, according to the data, most players will c-bet too often on low boards after you check. That's why it's especially disastrous for big blind to check with a weak pair when they could otherwise donk. With that said, let's get into the real fun part, the exploits. Players will make a few big mistakes after big blind donks on the flop. First and foremost, they will overfold on the flop, and they will also underraise. To help you grasp and remember these points in the most intuitive way possible, let's compare how the solver plays against a donk to how opponents do, starting with the solver. This is a very common board for big blind to donk, 5-4-3. Against the small donk, button is supposed to fold 18% of the time and raise around 11% of the time. Notably, they have to defend very wide with all of these air combos, including hands like king-queen, king-jack, and jack-9. Most of these have a backdoor flush draw, but many of them, like king-jack, do not. Mass data shows that most players will overfold by around 10% against a small flop donk. Their folding frequency on average is going to be 30%. Most likely, this overfold will come from this weaker overcard region. It's quite rare for somebody to call with a hand like jack-9 clubs in-game. They also underraise by a little bit. The average raising frequency is just 8%. Likely, they simply miss bluff raises, which come from many of the same hands, like jack-9 of clubs. When button folds and underraises by this much, big blind is expected to donk 100% of the time. But personally, I think that donking 100% of the time here would be a little bit too aggressive for big blind. Later in the video, we'll look at some practical strategies tailored to opponent profile, detailing exactly how big blind should play. Also, before we move on, note that these are population averages. The average player will fold 30% of the time, but more passive opponents will fold more often than this. Even in this node lock sim, in position is never folding hands like king 3 or queen 4, which many players will simply throw away. Likewise, how often in position raises is going to differ a little bit from opponent to opponent. Some players might over-raise with their overpairs and top pairs, while other players might simply almost never raise against a flop donk with anything but strong hands. It's important to be aware of opponent profile when building a good, robust donking strategy. But let's move on to the turn, which will be our final exploit for this video. After in-position players call the small flop bet, they will make a few big mistakes on the turn. First and foremost, they will again overfold against a turn barrel. Secondly, they will also underraise against a turn barrel, especially against smaller turn barrels. And lastly, if big blind decides to check on the turn, in-position players will understab. Hopefully, by now you can tell that in-position players just really suck at playing these lines. That's why donking on the flop performs so incredibly well. Big blind usually bets small on the turn in bet-bet, especially from late positions. As I described in the donking course, we typically want to deviate from this. If big blind does bet small, however, then in position has another extremely low defending threshold. They are once again only allowed to fold 16% of the time and actually have to raise 17% of the time. They still have to call all of their weaker pairs, even on this double flush draw board. They're also supposed to raise their top pairs at a very high frequency, in part to deny a lot of equity. But most players will overfold even after overfolding a bit on the flop and thus coming into the turn with a slightly stronger range. I would say that it's very rare for an in-position player to call with weaker pairs. Data shows that in-position players will again overfold by around 10% versus a small turn bet, suggesting that they don't call with these hands nearly often enough. They also raise only around 10 to 12% of the time against a small bet. I think it's very rare for players to raise as often as solver does with their 10x. Even with the flush draw, I think 10-9 of hearts is a bit more of an intuitive call for most players. Likely, the node lock solution we're looking at is more conservative than the way in-position players really play this spot. Needless to say, taking this bet-bet line is absolutely excellent. However, there's still a better line for bluffing. And this has to do with the fact that in-position players fold even more often against bet-check-bet, and big blind can take bet-check-bet more often due to the turn understab. Remember that if big blind checks on the turn, in-position will not bet often enough. They might bet a little bit too often with certain hands like overpairs, especially in early positions, but they will usually check with too many weak pairs and too many ace-highs. This weakens their range coming into the river and sets them up for a very low defending threshold against bet-check-bet. If you've seen my previous videos and you're subscribed to the channel, you'll know that one of the biggest data correlations that I love talking about is the fact that players will massively overfold when they have to call with a lot of weak hands. That's pretty much the basis for all sorts of good bluffing strategies. According to the math, bet-check-bet is around 25% better than bet-bet as an exploit. Betting on the turn does work out a little bit better for strong hands though, especially when you consider the way in-position players play on the river. If you're interested in learning about those river mistakes, as well as some more big blind theory, then check out that new Donking course available at Savant. There's a lot there, even in the free portion of the course. Follow the link down below, get access to it for free, and if you like it, then let me help you out by giving me the opportunity to teach you full big blind mastery. This course goes hand in hand with our flagship course of the month, which is all about big blind defense. Get a Savant membership for even just 1 month, and you will get access to our full course library. We're still doing our early bird discount, and you'll also get access to our upcoming flagship course, which covers some important 3-bet pot strategy. But let's get back into it. There's one more section I have for the video, and this covers exactly how to switch up the donking strategy against different player types. As I mentioned, there will be some opponents that raise a bit too often, some that fold a bit too often, and some in between. The way we structure a good donking strategy is going to be different against each. Let's start with the opponent type, which I call the good aggro reg. This is generally a good reg at 100 NL and higher, and is someone who has a pretty solid understanding of the game. These players will raise a lot, they'll bluff a lot, and they're overall quite attentive to what's happening. Controlling one's aggression is extremely important against them, because if big blind starts playing too aggressively, then this is the player who will catch on. Most likely, this player is going to deviate from the solver strategy on the flop in a few key ways. First and foremost, they likely won't overfold way too much. This is likely not the player type who will start overfolding weaker pairs against a flop donk. That would be more so the passive, weaker player, which we'll talk about next. This player also might overraise against a flop donk, especially if big blind is known to have an aggressive table image. And lastly, this might be the player type who actually checks back too often on the flop. On average, players will c-bet too often on these sorts of lower boards, but the good reg might check back for a few reasons. First and foremost, they are more likely to realize that big blind has an inherent range advantage on these lower connected flops. And secondly, they're more likely to realize that most players will not donk often enough on the flop. In my experience, I found that many of these players will simply check with their range on the flop, knowing that big blind probably has too strong of a range, because the average player donks far less often than the solver. Against this player, big blind might want to go with the following strategy. First and foremost, big blind might want to bet more often with their strongest hands. The idea is that if they bet, they will face the overraise, but if they check, they will face the under c-bet. Donking is therefore the most efficient value line. By contrast, the medium strength hands, like weaker pairs, would like to check on the flop. These hands hate facing an overraise and just want to get to showdown facing the least amount of pressure. Therefore, checking with these hands is the best move for big blind. As for bluffs, these hands can really go either way. The weakest bluffs in big blind's range don't really care about the overraise because they don't have a lot of equity to lose. They're instead far more focused on how often in position folds. I'd say that the good aggro reg is still probably going to overfold by something like 5 to 8%, and therefore bluffing on the flop is a great move. However, checking on the flop can also be good, because then they'll face the under c-bet, and they'll have a good bluffing opportunity on the turn. They can really go either way, and I think mixing it up, at least somewhat, to balance out the strong donks is probably the best thing big blind can do. You'll notice that this strategy still has a lot of mixed frequency donks, and that's important against a good aggro opponent. Remember, this player is more likely to catch on to what big blind is doing, so any exploit has to be quite subtle. That's not the case for our next opponent type, which is the passive weak regular. This is a player type that is common at every single stake, even up to high stakes. Analysis shows that this player type will fold far more often than the population average, and from shared experience, pros know that this player is far less likely to catch on to any exploits. Simply, this is a player type who will consistently overfold and underraise. Against this type, big blind should take the hyper-exploitative route of massively overdonking with their bluffs. These hands benefit most from the big overfold. Medium-strength hands like weak pairs also prefer to donk, and the reason why is important to understand. First and foremost, these medium-strength hands do benefit from the overfold. Especially if big blind overfolds hands as strong as second pair, then the weakest pairs in big blind's range love taking this line. Weak pairs also benefit from the turn understab. Passive players are more likely to understab on the turn, primarily because they underbluff. Therefore, by donking on the flop, big blind can benefit from the overfold and then check on the turn and face less pressure from in position. But there's one more important point to consider, and that is the fact that more passive players will likely over c-bet on the flop. And this one is very interesting. Even though this player type is passive, data shows that they c-bet too often on lower boards. The only good explanation for this is the fact that a lot of in-position players will range bet on the flop, trying to simplify their decision-making process. Avoiding this over c-bet is another reason why weaker pairs prefer to donk. And of course, this really goes hand in hand, but the strongest hands in big blind's range would like to check in order to take the check-raise line. To be fair, I feel like this point about the c-bet strategy can be a little bit player dependent, so if possible, big blind should try to make a slightly more nuanced decision based on the specific opponent. However, I'm very confident in this strategy against the average passive regular. You'll also notice that, especially compared to the previous example, this strategy is highly imbalanced. Big blind is mixing at a much lower frequency because the likelihood that this passive regular will catch on to what they're doing is lower. Therefore, big blind wants to take maximum advantage of this exploit. The fact that even most professional players don't, I think, is a disaster. Lastly, let's take a look at how big blind might want to play against a stationy passive player. This is someone who likely overcalls all across the game tree and also underraises. Some fish would likely fall into this category. The strategy almost gets flipped from the previous example. Against this player type, big blind wants to do a few things differently. First and foremost, they would like to donk more often with their medium-strength hands. These hands benefit a lot from the underraise and also get a bit more thin value since this player overcalls. These hands get a bit more value out of overcards right away, and something like top pair or even second pair can continue value betting on the turn and on the river. Bluffs, however, clearly don't want to donk as often. If the opponent overcalls, then these hands simply want to check. They can instead take something like a check-check bet line, which generates an overfold against almost every single player. Mixing in a few bets with these hands is a good idea just to appear a little bit balanced, but they overwhelmingly prefer to check. And lastly, let's take a look at our strong hands. These hands could, in fact, go either way. Obviously, strong hands like two pairs benefit from in-position overcalling, but they're a little bit hurt by the likely underraise. On the contrary, if they check, they will face an over c-bet on average, as described earlier, and could therefore take something like a check-raise, or a check-raise bet line. It all really depends on just how passive they are and how they respond against different lines. As a general rule of thumb, simply based on my research, a lot of which is available on the YouTube channel, I think the check-raise option is going to be a bit better, and therefore I think big blind would prefer to check with those hands on the flop. If it's strong enough to check-raise, I think checking is the best option. But if it's not strong enough to check-raise, then betting is probably best. And that just about covers it. At this point, you should have a crystal clear understanding of where solver donks, what mistakes opponents make, and how big blind should structure their strategy against 3 individual player types. If you want to learn more about theory and more about exploits, head over to the link down below to get access to the free portion of that new Savant course. And if you like what you see, I urge you to let me help you with your big blind mastery by getting a Savant membership. You'll get access to this course, all of our flagship courses, recordings to premium coaching calls, and so much more. In my opinion, it truly is a no-brainer. Follow the link down below and learn some real good strategy.